I'm happy to chat with my dear friend, Michael Djupstrom, very soon. He's currently living in Berlin. As a composer, he received many awards from institutions such as the American Academy of Arts and Letters. As a person, he's always very curious and positive. He lived in many different countries. I hope we can all get a little bit of inspirations from him. Hi, Mike. Thank you so
Well,
much for being my guest. How's everything for you in Berlin?
things are good. Today's pretty rainy, but it's always rainy in Berlin, so that's fine.
Oh, I really miss chatting with you and playing music with you. I hope we can, get to do that again in the near future. Um, as a musician myself, I have to say I always enjoy playing your music. They're always very beautiful, especially in our time. You still sort of stay true to yourself and try to make music beautiful. I wonder how how did you first discover music?
Actually, through my mom. My mom played piano when she was a little girl, I think probably through middle school period, something like that. And her parents had a piano, so whenever we visited them, I would play on the piano for fun. And my mom noticed I was so excited about it, so she showed me like the basics of music. Um, Neither of my parents were professionals at all, so I didn't really have any, I guess, professional guidance. But my parents were always very supportive of me learning more about music. So once they realized I was interested in music, eventually they bought me a little keyboard. Um, at one point, I have a sister who's 5 years older, and she was studying a recorder in school. Everybody had to play the recorder. And I wanted to play her recorder more than she wanted to play her recorder. So my parents bought me a recorder, and then little by little, I learned more about my own interest in music.
Thank you for sharing that. And later on, how did you decide that you want to pursue a career as a composer?
Mm. Well, I always wrote little pieces. Like even when I was a really little kid, I wrote a piece called Haunted House. I think that's the first one I wrote down. And it had a little ghost on it on the score. But I thought it was normal. Like I thought everybody who played the piano or played clarinet or whatever you did, I thought that everybody wrote music. I thought that was just something that was natural. Um, and even when I should have been doing other things, like when I was in school and I might have been bored with English class or something like that, I would write little pieces of music in the margins of the paper. And I just thought that was a normal thing to do. And then years later, when it came time to decide what I would study when I was going to college, I knew I wanted to study music, but I never really had any serious piano training. I had studied with a local organist, um, who taught me everything I knew really up to that point. But she hadn't been very serious about it herself. She had always said, if you want to study music seriously, you should go study with such and such. And I said, no, I'm not planning on doing anything professional with this. So then when it came time to decide what I would do, even if I had wanted to be a concert pianist, it was too late. I didn't have the right training. I didn't have the right technique built up at that point. So I thought, well, if I can't be a pianist, and I had also played saxophone and I'd played oboe, but neither very seriously either. The
Mhm.
only thing else I did in music was write music. So I thought, well, let's just see. So I sent in a lot of portfolios to different schools that I was applying to, and got into some of the schools, and then I ended up studying composition, and then that was that.
Wow. And would you also share about um, sort of your own methods of composing music?
Well, every piece is different. I mean, that's a kind of sounds like a cop-out answer, but it's true, because at least at this point, whenever I start a piece of music, I usually I need to have some kind of idea, some kind of concept behind it that like is it that acts as a springboard to keep me like motivated or interested in writing that particular piece. And every piece, it can be something totally different. Like it could be a commission could have something very specific attached to it. Like somebody wants you to incorporate a certain folk song into the piece, or it could be that it has to be a celebratory work, or it could be I don't know, impacted by something that's happening in the world and I want to write a piece that reacts to it. Or it could be as simple as a performer that I really appreciate asked me for a piece, and then I'm inspired by her playing, for instance. So that varies from piece to piece. But when it comes right down to it, after I have that idea that drives me to write, I think very much musically, like not about the concept. The concept gets me going, but then when I'm actually writing the piece, it's a very like specific musical process. That's to say, like my decisions are based on musical reasons and musical criteria rather than just pure ideas. I think for me, it's when I'm composing, the thing that's always like in the forefront, always is this idea of balance. I'm really obsessed with everything being perfectly balanced. And that manifests in a lot of different ways. Like the broadest way I could think of is that I'm really concerned that the foreground and the background are in balance. And for me, the foreground basically, it doesn't have to only be melody, but it's very often it's about melody. That's like the foreground activity. And the background doesn't have to be, but very often when I talk about the background, I'm talking about the structure of the piece. So as I'm composing, I'm always trying to make sure that the thing that's happening, that people can hear, that a listener is actively being shown, so to speak, usually the melody, is interesting. The foreground element needs to be compelling. And then the background element, in this case, structure, as in how the piece unfolds from the beginning to the end, needs to be constantly sort of under control. Like I need to know how the piece is progressing at every moment when I'm writing it in order to keep everything in balance. So for me, it's about keeping people's attention all the time, but making sure that I, as the composer, know where the piece is going. So when I start a piece of music, I have that idea that I'm talking about, some kind of concept that starts it. And then I usually assemble some kind of motivic material or melodic material, something. And that could come in any form. It could be like in a whole melody that somehow just appears in my head, or it could be a tiny little melodic fragment that I play with in order to make more material out of it. But anyway, I have a set of that melodic or motivic material that I assemble and set it kind of to one side. And then using that, I have an idea of how I want the whole piece to unfold, sort of like a blueprint. I make a blueprint for the structure. And sometimes it's like a harmonic blueprint. I have like an idea of how the key centers or how the harmony will unfold. Sometimes it's a little more general, like a dramatic structure. It could be as simple as I know that it's going to start very peacefully and it'll take about 3 minutes to develop into a more agitated state. And then the agitation will last, something like that. In any case, there's like a blueprint, a plan. And once I have that material, the melodic material, and I have the blueprint, then I basically start from the beginning and go chronologically through the piece. And often the blueprint is changed, or I throw it out entirely and create a new plan as I'm going. But I need to have a kind of idea all the time of what's happening in the foreground and then the background, how it's progressing, in order for me to feel like I know how the piece is going. And those two things in combination, it's like always happening constantly. These two things kind of like calling for attention all the time in my head.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that.
Actually, if you say you want to know because as a performer, you want to know what is important, that's interesting because I've never thought about that. To me, I think it's easy for performers to see the foreground because it's right there on the page. The notes are there and the articulations are there and the expressive markings are there. But for performers, it's probably harder to see the background because you're looking at the music like this. So yeah, if someone was going to play a piece of music of mine,
Mm-hmm.
I would say once they've internalized all of that foregone material, they should try to step back and see it from farther away
Mm-hmm.
and understand how the piece progresses from the beginning to the end. I mean, that's a very, I guess you could say that about a lot of composers, but in my own case, that those two things really matter. Not only what's happening up front, but how it develops throughout the whole piece.
Wow. That actually really explains um, how you sort of interpret music in general, not just your music, also
Yeah,
other composers' music.
exactly.
I
Yeah.
know that you are still, performing as a pianist, and I wonder. So you yourself as a composer, and at the same time you also basically recreate other composers' works. Um, do you feel that this part is very crucial for you to keep on playing, to keep on performing?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the reason I do it when it really comes down to it is because I like it, right? That's why we do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't honestly imagine not performing. I couldn't imagine not still playing on a really sort of banal level. If I only wrote music, I'd get bored. It's that simple. And if I only played the piano, I'd get bored. But being able to do both keeps things alive, keeps things fresher for me. So that's an easy, obvious answer. But to answer your question more in the direction you were mentioning yourself, yeah, I think that performing really, really helps composers in general, helps me, and would help any composer to know, on the one hand, what performers are dealing with themselves when they're performing a piece of music. So that way, as a composer, you know what you're asking,
Mm-hmm.
not just in terms of the instrumental technique, but in terms of like psychologically what you're requesting them to do. If you write a passage that's constantly energetic for 3 minutes long,
Mm-hmm.
it's really difficult to get that much energy as a performer and not to let it drop.
Mm-hmm.
So having to do that yourself teaches you what a performer has to deal with, and that informs your writing as a composer.
Mm-hmm.
But also in a more, I don't know, in a more general sense, I think that for me, performing keeps me interested and active as a musician. So all parts of my brain, all parts of my musical brain at least, are working, and
Mm-hmm.
not just the more intellectual side, which is honestly what gets engaged the most as a composer.
Wow. Thank you.
I think you should compose too, though. On the flip side, I think that performers should compose just like composers should perform,
I would
because
love
it
to.
teaches you to think about music in a different way. If you
Exactly.
were always thinking yourself about foreground, background constantly, when you played Bach, you'd see the background faster
Mm-hmm.
because you'd be thinking like a composer. Yeah, I think we really need to we need to be musicians and
Mm-hmm.
not be performers or composers. We just need to be musicians. It
Wow.
wasn't until
Yeah.
relatively recently that we had this division. In the past, people used to, it was natural. We did everything. So I think we should go back in that direction personally.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. Most of the extraordinary artists we know from the past, they did everything. They, not only just compose and play one instrument, they sometimes actually manage to play multiple instruments.
Yeah.
Um, I know that you're a huge fan of one of these type of musicians, George Enescu,
Mhm.
and you have such kind of a passion for exploring his music, and then you also learned Romanian, um, like recently, and I remember when we were in Bucharest together, you managed to introduce your piece um, completely in Romanian, and the public was really, really impressed by that. So I wonder, as a composer, you know you always try to explore different culture, including Romanian, French, even Chinese, now a little bit German influence as well. Can you maybe share with us how all these cultural influences shaped your artistry and also worldview.
I think, yes, I can answer that in a little bit of a roundabout way. I think the most important thing for me in life in general is to keep curiosity in my life, to keep myself intellectually, personally curious, because it keeps life new. And when you're curious, there are amazing things in the world that you can discover. You just need to put a little bit of effort in.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as I'm curious, I keep trying to find new things. And in my life, I've often just been curious about different cultures, different languages specifically, but also cultures in general. So these different, I don't know if you want to call them phases or whatever, these different sort of fascinations I've had with different cultures, like you said, with French culture or Romanian culture, they came about naturally just because I'm curious about the world. And with probably only that one exception, the Romanian exception, mm-hmm. I wouldn't say that in general, I don't try or I haven't tried deliberately to have those cultural phases or impressions that I've received or those experiences I've had. Mm-hmm. I haven't tried to bring them out deliberately in my music. It's been more like just that those experiences have enriched my life. And my music itself is also, I think we've talked about it a little bit or alluded to it. My music is also pretty natural. I'm not a terribly conceptual composer. It comes out of my own musical experiences. Mm-hmm. I write the music that I want to hear, basically. So the cultural influences have enriched my life in a natural way. And then because the music, hopefully, it comes out also in a natural way, in some way, those experiences have come out in the music. But in general, I don't try to have a direct correlation between those cultural experiences and the music itself. Mm-hmm. Not deliberately, at least. The Romanian thing is a little bit different. You mentioned that I was interested in George Enescu. And after I had really learned everything I could, basically, about his music, it led me to discover music of other Romanian composers. There are many, many composers who are active in Romania in the entire 20th century who are really just not known. Living composers, of course, also who are not known. But even people who are long gone, their music isn't known outside of Romania. And through learning about all those composers, I learned a little bit about the folk music of Romania also, mm-hmm. Because that was a huge influence on many of those classical composers. And so I wrote a handful of pieces when I tried to bring something of the Romanian folk music into my own music. But that was a bit of an exception, I think.
I feel that, as a composer, especially your American composer, you embrace so many different elements from different culture. So your identity is kind of very cosmopolitan to me as a musician who plays your music. So I understand that you probably don't overthink about that. You just sort of naturally always embrace all these different elements and they sort of just show in your music naturally. I do wonder, do you see, what is your vision of your identity, politically speaking?
Politically speaking?
And musically speaking. Do you see yourself American? Or how do you interpret that your American identity, both as a composer and also as a person?
I think that nowadays, I can really only speak from my own experience, of course, but it seems to me that nowadays people's identities are much more fluid than they ever have been before. Whether we're talking about personality or musical identities.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, people are always influenced by other people, and musicians, in this case composers, have always been influenced by other music. But in the past, it really feels like there were stricter rules about who could do what in which culture.
Mm-hmm.
Even 15 years ago or so, there were more barriers, I would say, especially in certain European music cultures, but also in the United States also. And now maybe it's just because information is exchanged so rapidly across the world.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's not the only reason, but in any case, those kinds of barriers are breaking down, I think. I've seen I haven't heard them, but I've seen a number of scores printed and published and sold in Europe that I don't think would have been sold by the same publishers 15 years ago. And I never personally was so concerned about those ideas of what was allowed and what wasn't allowed, at least not consciously. Of course, I had pressure in certain parts of my brain or from outside sources telling me what I should and should not be writing. But I think something of that confidence in yourself and your own voice, or maybe even more than that, not caring so much what other people think.
Mm-hmm.
I think that might be a kind of American trait on some level. I think that for better or for worse, Americans as a culture are quite individualistic. So maybe it's not surprising that those sort of barriers between styles or rules about style and music broke down sooner in the United States than in Europe, for instance. So perhaps that idea of being able to freely express in whatever language you want, or to use whatever elements you want, to assimilate them into your own voice, hopefully.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's an American trait. I'm not actually sure, but that's one way to answer your question. Politically speaking, that's much harder, especially now. It's, yeah, sometimes I'll admit it, sometimes I would rather just say I'm Canadian. If someone hears my accent, they can tell I'm from North America. I would really like to be able to say I'm Canadian. Of course, I'm not. No names, necessary to be spoken here, but it's not a time when I'm particularly proud of my country right now. In Europe, it's probably even more obvious why that would be the case. But also there is something, not really politically, but just culturally in general, about Americans. I think we're quite optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
Again, but for better or for worse, we're very optimistic, really. We're very individualistic, and I think we're quite open. And all of those traits, I think I have them. So for better or for worse, I'm definitely American. It doesn't matter how many different cultural influences I've absorbed. I'm definitely an American.
Thank you for sharing that. Talking about being optimistic, I, as your friend, I often sense that that you just always can see the brighter side of everything, and you are always very not just optimistic, but extremely genuine, very supportive for your friends, also for communities. I do wonder, what's your secret of being hopeful, being happy in life?
Well, I'm glad you think I'm always hopeful and happy. I wouldn't say that I always feel hopeful and happy, but I've already said it before, but I think it really comes down to trying to retain your curiosity for the world. At least for me, if I believe and I cultivate that belief, that there's always something to be discovered, that the world is not limited to the way we see it here, but there's something new around the corner, or there's something new in another year. The idea that there's always something new waiting to be discovered and to be explored, that keeps me hopeful. Yeah, even if I'm not happy, I would say, yeah, you're right. I think I'm almost always hopeful. And I really think it comes down to trying to retain curiosity. Something that I think a lot of people, maybe almost everybody, has when you're younger, but for who knows which reasons, people sometimes lose it. And I think making an effort to retain that active curiosity about the world is key, at least in my own experience.
Thank you. I also wonder, as a composer, I know that you have some of your own perhaps opinions about aesthetic and also the function of music, especially in modern time. Maybe you can share about that as well.
Well, I mentioned before a little bit that I think nowadays there are fewer barriers than ever before. And not only that there are fewer barriers and rules about what you can write, but I think that the way people write nowadays, we have, because anybody with an internet connection has access to almost any kind of musical style they want. I'm sure there are some exceptions, but almost anything can be found on YouTube or Naxo's music library, right? I think that because of that availability of information, almost anybody who wants to be exposed to a certain kind of music or wants to explore a certain style or technique in their own music can do it now. Even if you have a teacher who's extremely dogmatic and insists you only write in a certain way, you can just go home and turn your computer on and find recording of the music, and half the time find the score if you want to look at how someone's written something down, and you can pursue whatever path you want. That, I think that's pretty incredible. I mean, that was not the case in any era before. It was difficult in certain political periods to get access to certain scores. It's still today, of course, there are some places where you can't access anything you want on the internet. That's a separate question, really. But most places you can access anything you want. So I think for a young composer, it's not so difficult now. Maybe not difficult, it can still be challenging, but any young composer can, if he or she wants to, follow the path that he or she wants to follow. And that's incredible. That's something I can't imagine. I mean, that luxury or that availability of choice is something fantastic. Of course, success in like a professional sense, success in your career, that's something else. There are still people who are sort of the gatekeepers for careers. The people who commission you, they're going to be festival presenters or concert presenters or performers themselves, and they have their own ideas about what musical styles or what musical languages they like. So of course, just having the courage and the availability, the courage and the possibility to follow whatever path you want doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to immediately have professional success. But the first step, I think, is just doing what you want to. And hopefully somebody who does have the ability to help you will want to help you, to give you professional opportunities. And for that matter, the way things work now, I don't know how much longer this model of certain people having control over those opportunities, I don't know how much longer that model will last. Because with anyone being able to promote their own music on the internet or social media or YouTube or whatever, I mean, I can't predict what's going to happen, but there are plenty of people who could be discovered who can just bypass those more traditional sort of gatekeepers, so to speak. The first step in any case is now style and musical technique is more wide open than ever before.
I remember when we were, I guess, again in Bucharest, we went to some young composers concerts, and I specifically remember that you talk about their basic two functions of I guess compositions in our time. One is more like experimental. They're more like lab researches.
Yeah.
That sort of leads to maybe kind of more revolutionary ways of using different kind of techniques in compositions. The other function is more sort of geared towards audience, try to use still like a language of music to create stories, to share something a bit more universal, emotionally speaking, and connect with audience. So I wonder, for you as a composer, how do you see yourself, with these two basic categories?
Yeah. I'd forgotten about that, but I remember that conversation now. Yeah, I think what I said was my two categories. One was experimental, just like you said, that there are these pieces that are sort of like research in a lab. It's a scientist composer, so to speak, where he or she is trying to discover things that haven't been done before. And I think what I said on the other side was other composers use all of those different techniques to create a synthesis. That's what I tried to say, was experimentation and synthesis. And the composers who are like me, I can tell you like me, interested in making this sort of synthesis out of the experiments that have been done by other people, like you said, generally incorporate those ideas in a more traditional framework, or I think maybe narrative is a good way. In my own music, at least, that ideas tend to have a beginning and the music progresses to an ending of some kind. I'd forgotten all about that. But yes, I see myself in not the experimental camp, in the other camp, the composers who most of our effort is used in making a synthesis from different ideas, experimental ideas and traditional ideas.
Thank you.
And actually, interesting, you mentioned audience. Just because I think I've thought about this before. For me, I usually don't think about the audience, but I do think about the musicians, the ones who will perform it. And I realize that the people I'm writing for almost always are the musicians.
Interesting. Wow. Because I often, that's very interesting. I feel like, the whole experience of concerts, there are three components. So people who create music in the first place, people who interpret music, and then there's also the receivers, where both the musicians and also the audience. I would never actually think that your goal is actually always try to sort of create something for musicians, not for the audience.
In the beginning, of course, I'd never thought about it, but composers get asked that question a lot, how do you relate to the audience or something like that. And when I was thinking about it, I realized that I really don't think about the audience. But like you said, there are three people or three roles in my concert experience. And it is true that the composer perhaps has the initial role. Hopefully the material the composer writes is defining in some way for the whole concert experience. But whether the music is extremely experimental or extremely traditional or very good or very, very bad, the person who's going to have to present that music to the audience is not the composer. It's the performer. It's the interpreter. So for me, the most important thing is making sure that what I write is clear for the person who's going to perform it, what my intention is. Because he or she has to bring it to life. Otherwise it just sits on the page.
For sure. I also know that you are very, very well read. And look at all the books behind you. Would you mind sharing also some of your all-time favorite books or authors?
So people ask this question a lot, right? Your friends ask you too, what are your favorite books? So I have an answer. My answer is a little weird. It has two parts. Part one is there are many, many classics in literature which are fantastic. There's a reason that classics are classics, right? Because they're great books. That's the setup. Mm-hmm. Part two is that in a little bit the same way that you mentioned, I have had these sort of cultural phases or cultural interests. I realized that my reading progresses in the same way. I tend to get really excited about a particular author or particular groups of authors, sometimes particular languages, and I read a lot of books by that author or in that language, and the books seem really important and really fantastic and really meaningful. And 3 years later, looking back on it, I can't say for sure if those books really have impacted me in a way that I can specify, or that in a way I can put a finger on. But then a new phase has begun, and then I'm fascinated in something else. And then I devour that literary culture or linguistic culture. And then I move to another one. So having said that there are classics in literature which are fantastic, and no doubt they're great books for a reason. And having said that, I tend to move in these sort of stages through my literary experience. Mm-hmm. My answer to what are your favorite books is I will tell you who I liked in some of those different stages. And I don't think they're necessarily the best books or even the best books I've ever read. It's just that they're books which seemed fascinating to me at the time, and that are probably authors that aren't as commonly recognized. I mean, we could talk about, I don't know, Dostoevsky or something because it's great, but a lot of people could talk about Dostoevsky, right? So, and better than I could. So I'll tell you some very just unique authors, I think, at least. The first author that I look back on like these linguistic camps, I was studying Spanish when I was a lot younger, and I was reading books by Isabel Allende. Mm-hmm. I thought it was the most fantastic thing I'd ever read. She is, quite well known. She's hardly like a fringe figure, but something about the way that she incorporates a very unrealistic, fantastical situations in a normal universe appealed to me. Now that's a kind of, that magic realism it's called. It shows up in a lot of Latin American literature, but I thought that her stories were extremely compelling. I wrote one piece of music based on a story of hers called Wally Mai, that that piece, of course.
I played it often.
Often?
Yeah.
So, she was very important for me. She's one author. Later on, I got interested in French literature when I was living in France. It became a big part of my life, and for the next several years, I just read tons and tons of French books. There's a French author named Daniel Pennac, Pennac, who's written in a lot of genres, written essays and memoirs and lots of novels. And maybe his most famous set of novels, it surrounds one particular character whose name is Benjamin Malocène, and he's a kind of lovable hero who isn't really made out to be a hero, but he has to be a hero. They're crime novels set in one particular neighborhood in Paris. All of the characters are sort of like fringes, a little bit fringes in French society, and they're all lovable, and it's extremely funny in a strange kind of dark way. So these Daniel Pennac novels, I really like them. More recently, I started reading a little bit of German books, and there's an author named Erich Kästner who hasn't written that many books for adults. He wrote a lot of really well-known children's books in German, but one of his books in German is called Three Men in the Snow. And one of his adult books in German is called Three Men in the Snow. And it's so sweet and innocent and lovely. I read a couple books of his adult books, and he has a way at looking at different kinds of people within society and kind of seeing what's funny or what's inconsistent in people from every walk of life. But he does it in some kind of sympathetic way. He never really is making fun of the characters, or maybe he's like laughing with everybody and never at them. And I think that that kind of balance is really marvelous. So he's my latest find, so to speak.
Thank you for sharing that. During this period of time, we have just so much time to read. So I'm always very curious what my friends are actually reading or what their favorite books are. So I can pick some of them and to fill up my time.
Have you read The Great Gatsby?
Yes, I did.
Well, I was thinking about it. I should say at least one classic book. I think Gatsby is fantastic. There's something about American culture. You know, speaking about American culture, something about American culture, about Americans' optimism, about Americans' maybe cynicism at the same time. It's a weird balance between optimism and cynicism, and kind of wild energy is captured really well in that book. But you've already read it, so go read the other 3 authors.
No, it's great to know your all-time favorite ones. So my very last question, which I always ask all my guests, I know it's not necessarily a very easy question to be answered, but right now, in the moment, what makes you feel life is meaningful?
I think meaningful. That's hard. I think when I feel like what I'm doing matters to somebody, whether that be professional, whether that means what I'm writing or what I'm playing is meaningful for people listening or for people performing it, or whether that means for friends or for my family that I'm there, that I can talk to them. That's what matters. It's that whatever I'm doing matters to other people. I'm not the kind of person who could be alone. I'm not one of those composers who would sit in his house out in the woods and write for 5 years. I could never do it. Then I also am not the kind of person who could sit alone in his apartment. I couldn't do it.
Thank you. Actually, this is how I feel as well. I mean, maybe that's why it makes the situation pretty difficult for a lot of us. Yeah. But I guess just to keeping that in mind and knowing that I guess as musicians we still have that core values, even if it's not being, let's say, being utilized in the moment, we still have that core value. So thank you for sharing that. Well, in any case, I hope you enjoy the rest of your summer in whether in Berlin or other parts of Europe, and hopefully we can meet up very soon, wherever that place will be. Thank you so much.
Thanks for asking me to do this. It was fun.
Have a good evening there.
Have a good day there.
See you.
See you. Bye-bye.